I just got back from a recent trip in Laos, the first one in 4 years, and noticed a huge amount of changes to the country, particularly regarding infrastructure and trade with China, that definitely warrants making a video on. I'm Flynn from Offshore in Asia. We help people move, do business and invest in Southeast Asia. When I was last in Laos 4 years ago, they were constructing the Lao-China Railway, and besides that, there was almost no real infrastructure in the country, bar a few dams that they'd been started building or had completed. In the last couple of years, Laos got a lot more aggressive and expansionist in its economic policies, if that's the right way to describe it. And it's very interesting to see because just those 4 years ago, there was almost nothing that they'd done in Laos. But just having gone back now, I've really noticed significant changes, particularly in infrastructure and mega projects across the country, the Lao-China Railway obviously being one of them, but many, many dams that Laos is now building in the effort to become the battery of Asia, as they're putting it. Tourism has also expanded and diversified. Even the infamous backpacker haven in Vang Vieng itself has a huge amount of Chinese and Korean tourists nowadays, which really shows the change that Laos is experiencing across its economy. Granted, all this positive talk of Laos' potential growth does come with some issues. There's huge inflation in the country right now due to the debts they're experiencing from financing the railway and COVID. And it is one of the most poor countries in Asia. It's ranked 140th in the world, which makes it one of the poorest countries outside of Africa. The brief but relevant history of Laos is that it hasn't changed a whole lot of its economy and how it goes about things. Overland trade has always been important, forest products have always been important, and rice has always been a staple crop. When Laos was colonized by France and became part of French Indochina, it earned only about 1% of French Indochina's GDP. Overland trade wasn't viable, and the French did hope that the Mekong would give them a direct route into Yunnan, China, where they can trade tea and ship it directly down the river, which, had it worked, would have been great. But there's too many rapids, too many floods, and the Mekong just isn't navigable. After World War II, Laos gained independence for a short time until the Kingdom of Laos was overthrown by the Pathet Lao, which is somewhat the same thing as the Khmer Rouge or Viet Cong of South Vietnam. After taking over, they became a very strict communist state, one of the more true communist states, if you could call it like that. Naturally, the economy wasn't doing too well, and in 1986, they started new economic measures to boost growth, and this is somewhat similar to China liberalizing around the same time as well and experiencing that growth. Laos didn't experience the same boom, obviously. However, there was some foreign investment. Australia actually built a bridge between Thailand and Laos, the Lao-Thai Friendship Bridge, which is just outside of Vientiane, which opened up a lot of cross-border trade, no need for ferries. It makes it a lot quicker and more efficient trade. Since then, several more bridges have opened, and Laos is slowly but surely seeing a bit more investment over time, to the point now where the infrastructure in parts of the country is somewhat tolerable. Traveling in the south of the country or outside of the main, pretty much two roads, is challenging. Even in the south of the country, Highway number 1, the main highway that more or less runs along the Mekong, has almost no safety features. There's almost no road signs, there's no lines on the road, so it's perilous driving at night or in foggy conditions. I'd compare it to an average, somewhat untraveled country road in the west. However, this is where the large majority of the country's internal trade is happening. So that is a challenge that Laos is slowly overcoming. Between Vang Vieng and Vientiane, there is now a tollway, a 2-lane, that is actually very good. It's a beautiful road to drive on, and having traveled on it, it was not a problem whatsoever. Laos' main industries, in no particular order, it's quite hard to calculate and they change quite a lot, is tourism, mining, agriculture, and hydroelectricity. I'm not going to get into tourism, I've already touched on that. But agriculture is another one that's important in Laos. It's the main employer of Lao people. It's not a huge earner for the economy because a lot of Laotians are just subsistence farmers, so they aren't selling excess crops or dealing in much cash crops, with the exceptions of tobacco and coffee, which are small but growing and hopefully would grow more because Lao coffee is great in particular, and there's a lot of potential there if you look across their neighbours like Vietnam, who are doing great with it. Laos is very sparsely populated, one of the least so in Asia, so there is a huge amount of arable land that hasn't yet been used in Laos, and this is great for the Laotian people. As their population grows, they're not going to have so many problems as other countries will regarding feeding themselves, and combined with the hydroelectric dams that can also serve as water storage, crop irrigation and things like this shouldn't be as much of an issue as certain neighbours and people downstream from them. Mining is also important to Laos as well, and it's expected to grow. There's 2 particular combined gold and copper mines that make up the largest market share of Laos' mining revenue. Although mining is important, Laos is focusing a lot more now on hydroelectricity. As I mentioned before, their idea to be the battery of Asia that they really have been working towards. The idea is essentially one of geographic arbitrage. Laos is using its lower labour costs and huge water resources to dam up parts of the Mekong and other rivers such as the Nam Khan and Nam Un, which are two other very large rivers in the country, and then use these to generate hydroelectric power, which they'll sell to neighbours, particularly Thailand, but Cambodia, Vietnam, China, of course, are all options as well. All of these countries need power, and so does Laos, and this has given Laos a bit more reliable source of electricity, as well as a more affordable source. And I would hypothesize that with this lower cost of electricity, it could open up the door for manufacturing, particularly around Vientiane. With this cheaper source of electricity and lower cost of labour in Laos, and with the Laos-China Railway now connecting Vientiane, the capital, to China, this could open the door for manufacturing, and with the lower cost of electricity and labour, as well as a direct connection by train to China, this could open the door for some potential industry in future. I don't know, something to think about, something to keep an eye on. Again, it's just my hypothesis, so take it as you please. I do have to play devil's advocate here because it isn't all rosy, especially regarding the damming and the hydroelectric power. There's a huge environmental cost of these hydroelectric dams, which flows on into the economy as well. And even if you don't care about fish migration routes and you aren't an environmentalist, it is very important because fish is one of the main sources of protein for people in Laos, particularly those along the rivers who depend on wild caught fish for protein. These dams all throughout the Mekong and the Mekong Basin as a whole block fish migration routes, which the vast majority of commercially viable fish in the Mekong need to spawn, and it's having a direct impact on fish populations already. Fish migration routes are one thing. The other one is the impact on agriculture it has. One thing that I can't really figure out why Laos is doing it, but when they do release water from these dams on the Mekong, they release it very quickly, and it causes crops in Isan or northeastern Thailand to flood. This creates geopolitical tension between Laos and Thailand, its main buyer of its hydroelectric electricity, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with this in future. The other issue with the dams is by creating these areas of still water and stopping the flow in parts of the Mekong, it stops the transfer of nutrients from sediments from the Tibetan Plateau and elsewhere that flow into Southeast Asia and give its rice fields such fertility. If crops no longer have these free organic fertilizers, they're going to have to start relying on chemical fertilizers. The issue with this is A, they're expensive, and B, they damage waterways, and if you have rice fields filled with organic fertilizers and next year they're flooded again and the water flows back into the river, this causes algal blooms. We've seen this in the Darling River in Australia, where farmers have irrigated crops, fertilize them with synthetic fertilizers, and then when the synthetic fertilizer makes its way back into the smaller, now diminished flow river, it creates algal blooms, which kills fish and affects the ecosystem as a whole, which does have a direct economic impact. I can't stress that enough. There's also the human cost as well. Although these dams might help Laos and the Lao people as a whole, every time you build a dam, you need to flood a river, and most people in Laos live along riverbanks, and just this recent dam being built in Luang Prabang, which hasn't been completed yet, it's going to displace 10,000 people from their homes. I am bullish on Laos' long-term future. However, I do want to touch on a few acute issues that Laos is currently facing and has been for a while on and off, that being corruption, education, and inflation. Laos had challenges with all three of these things, particularly corruption. It's one of the most corrupt countries in Asia, and it suffers from endemic bribery at all levels of authority. And this is a challenge that has scared off investors in the past. Inflation has also been a concern. The Lao KIP has absolutely skyrocketed in recent years. As part of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Lao-China Railway was financed by China. Many outside observers said that the loan is far too big and Laos will never be able to repay it. At one point, it looked like Laos might even default on its loan. It hasn't, and I'm not sure what's going to happen in the future. I really aren't smart enough to say, and it's just so hard to know in such a small, closed country. However, this has affected inflation significantly, as did COVID. They both came around right at about the same time, so Laos really got done pretty bad by this one. Inflation is obviously a concern for many investors. This is why Cambodia is seen as the more savory option to many people, because it's dollarized, because it's a bit more clear as to how things work around. Personally, I really would like to see Laos transition to a more Cambodian style of growth, because what Cambodia is doing is working. I'm not saying they dollarize, I'm just saying they liberalize a bit, make it a bit more easy for direct foreign investment. The last thing I'm going to touch on is the actual operation of the Lao-China Railway, and I found this quite interesting. It has been touted as this incredible fast train through Laos, which it is quite cool to look at. When I saw it being built, it's such an incredible juxtaposition between the simple villages with just subsistence agriculture in different little valleys in Laos, with this huge fast railway going through it, which is quite interesting. However, it just doesn't seem to work like that, and it hasn't really seemed to help a whole lot of locals. As for helping the actual Laotian people, it's only really available to people who live right near the railway, because it's still hard to get to, and organising transport at one end or the other is difficult. Even in the cities, and this is what really surprised me, the train station for this super fast, convenient railway is half an hour outside of Vientiane, the main capital. Vientiane's a small place. It's 700,000 people, and it feels even smaller than that. You can drive across it in 20 minutes. From the airport, you can get to the center of town in no more than 10 minutes. But the railway is half an hour out. It's strange because even when you look on a map on a satellite, the railway is amongst rice paddies and little, very sprawly, urban kind of hamlety suburb things. So it's a strange place to put a railway station. Luang Prabang's the same thing. And the one in Luang Prabang even goes closer to the town than where it stops. It's just very odd. That can't really be changed. However, what can be changed is the booking system. You have to book 3 days out online, and if you're a foreigner, it's going to cost more, and you have to show them your passport and things like this. And going through it is really like going through an airport, but just to get on a train. It's still quicker than getting a minivan from Vientiane to Luang Prabang. The whole trip takes about 6 to 7 hours in a minivan. The train with wait times and getting to and from the station at each end takes maybe 3 or 4 hours, and the actual journey is about 2 hours with a fast train. The railway also uses standard gauge track, which is different to the rest of Indochina, which uses meter gauge track. This means that trains have to swap around their cargo or change tracks, whatnot, but the same trains that use the Lao China Railway can't use the Lao to Thailand Railway, so they can't go into Vietnam, things like this. Not that all of them are connected right now anyway, and they do intend on making a standard gauge track that goes all the way to Singapore, this whole idea of the China to Singapore Railway and back. All of this asks then, what does Laos' future look like? I think in the short to mid-term, it might be a bit challenging for the next couple of years as Laos works through inflation and a few other issues it's experiencing. But with improvements in infrastructure, direct foreign investment, its young population, I think Laos' future is bright. Make sure to keep an eye on Laos, because we certainly are as well. Feel free to subscribe, because every time we learn something new about the country, we are going to make videos on it and talk about it more, because we really are chomping on the bit to get started, because it's a very fascinating country, and it's really the last place, bar maybe Burma, which is just too far in the weeds, in Southeast Asia, that really does have that potential just to skyrocket. And we're really looking forward to that moment so we can jump in and get started.